Good morning, Professor Spooner. How are you?
Good morning, Frank. Good morning.
Hi.
We're on at a different time, and I'm not sure what time of the day it is yet. But what's on my mind this week is the crucial phase, which is the term I used for the subtitle of a book, an edited volume I published on globalization 3 years ago. And I used it then because I could see that the world was everyday life, and the world we live in, it was changing faster now than probably at any time in world history. And it was producing very interesting new things, but also changes which were difficult to deal with, which were causing new problems. And I think that this has continued to happen. And the news today is particularly interesting because there's one piece of news to the effect that physicists have discovered something new about the universe, that the rate of expansion of the universe, I think they call it the Hubble constant, is accelerating faster than they had understood before, and this is something they first worked out 100 years ago. And Stephen Hawking is predicting that we're going to have to move to another planet before the end of this millennium anyway. So that obviously produces enormous new problems. But the point is that as our population continues to increase, even though the rate of increase has slackened somewhat, and the number of people interacting with each other and working together, the number of brains that are somehow working together on similar projects continues to increase. So human brain power becomes more powerful. We're discovering new things at an increasing rate. So that's the positive part of what's going on in this crucial phase. But the negative part is that we're having increasing problems in organizing ourselves. And in the last week, I think these problems have begun to look even worse than they were before. I mean, the main news recently has been in Syria. Wherever war does break out, it's a global war, not in the sense that the whole world is fighting globally, but in the sense that if there's war in one place, everybody has a hand in it somehow.
Right.
It becomes more and more impossible to bring it to an end. The war in Syria started, I think, 7 years ago?
Yes.
And the difficulties in bringing to any sort of agreement together between the main parties who are fighting there is it's becoming more and more difficult. And nobody can see a way out of it. And on one side of Syria is Turkey, where we have an interesting example, interesting but unfortunate example of a country that was a major power up until the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire, and seems to be trying to get that power back in some way. It can't forget the power of the past. And we see similar problems with Russia, which was one of the world's major powers through the 19th century. And then when the Russian Empire changed to the Soviet Union after the First World War, became another type of major power which had global ambitions. And since that form of organization folded in 1991, we thought that Russia was going to become a sort of country that we liked to interact with. But in fact, it was taken over by somebody who was a major figure in the power of the Soviet Union towards in the last decade or so, and the basis of his popularity in the Soviet Union, in the Russian Federation, seems to be that he continues to have global ambitions.
Yes.
So it's not only in what they call the near abroad of Ukraine and other areas that used to be republics of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, but also interest in other parts of the world, that is maintaining his popularity in Russia. So it's not only him we should be worried about, it's the basis of his popularity there.
Mm-hmm.
America still continues to think of itself as a global power, even though I understand only 30% of Americans have passports, and so they're not global travelers. So far, the British don't seem to be trying to revive their empire, but the Chinese, that always considered itself to be the Middle Kingdom, even though it hasn't been a world power for several centuries, has started recently. In the last 50 years, it's been growing. Its global interests have been growing, and it's becoming a more interesting power on a global level.
Yes.
So the problem in the foreseeable future is that on the one hand, what our abilities, our technological and scientific abilities, are getting more and more promising, but our ability to organize ourselves doesn't seem to be able to keep up with the rate of change, because even if the the population growth slackens, nevertheless the amount of travel is increasing, and that similarly makes things more and more difficult. And the methods we had, which we were very proud of over the last 100 years or so, of organizing what we understood to be democratic nation states, which the West has really tried to impose on the rest of the world, are not working so well in the West anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And we have no idea yet of a different way to organize a global world. That's a long introduction.
Well, yeah, that's I think necessary. I think that it's interesting because we often overlook, or at least I do, the fact that institutional organization has accelerated. It has. I mean, it moves at a snail's pace compared to social and cultural organizational acceleration. But if you look at even recent history, look at the grouping of nations that came together to work on the Iranian nuclear deal. That was a group of very strange bedfellows. The Russians, the Americans, the French, the Europeans. Everybody got together with the Iranians and worked through it. Look at the Global Warming Pact that was signed in Paris. Again, an unusual collection of countries. And you can go right down the line, so to speak, even the Olympics that are going on now in South Korea, with the North Koreans being present and the Vice President of the United States standing there next to Kim Jong-un's sister. Institutions are beginning to adapt, glacially perhaps, but they're beginning to adapt and they're beginning to try to catch up. But the speed of the individual citizen and citizen groups, and once you get off the boundaries and the constrictions of a government entity or an institution of any size, things happen at a light speed that the government can't match.
Yes, well, and it's interesting that one of the major empires of the past was the Persian Empire, and the Saudis and others in the Middle East are now, and I think the same thing has been said in America, are accusing the Iranians of trying to rebuild the Persian Empire.
Yes.
Without any real evidence at all. No, it's true. The Olympics, the climate conference, and the agreement to restrict Iran's acquisition of nuclear weapons are interesting achievements. However, they don't really solve any problems. And of course, the Americans dropped out of the climate agreement. People are trying to bring an end to the Iranian treaty, the JCPOA, and the Olympics. Maybe people are still. Maybe it's because it's competition that it works. Competition without any possible bad results.
Plus, it's scheduled to end tomorrow night anyway. So, yes, I just think it's. I'm not. Let me ask you a question. Do government institutions and entities that are having difficulty adapting, do you think they recognize their inability to adapt?
I don't know that they see it in those terms. Certainly America doesn't see it in those terms.
No.
It's difficult to know who else one should try to measure against this. Because there's so much difference between the problems as they're experienced in large countries that used to be empires and small countries that weren't even nations. And part of the problem is that we've imposed this idea of nation, which was a fiction to begin with anyway. And it worked in England because England was an island. And so there was much more interaction between all the people on the island before anyway. But it's more or less worked in France and Germany, but it works pretty poorly in most other parts of the world.
Well, when you talk about the crucial phase of globalization, where is the cruciality going to come from? In the speed of the change on the part of citizenry, hitting the resistance of the lack of speed of change on the institution's part? Where do you see that?
I see it, obviously because I'm a social scientist, as the problems that derive from the increasing rate at which the numbers of people who have to do things together is increasing, and our ability to keep changing our ways of organizing interaction to keep up with the numbers of people that have to be included. So that on the one hand, the things work intellectually, of people learning from each other and building on what they learn from each other, but they don't work organizationally in terms of people actually politically being able to organize the world around them efficiently. Okay.
So where do you see that eventually going? I mean, the institutions are going to be superseded. There's no doubt about that. I mean, we're seeing that in a small way right now with the gun debate in the United States. A group of 15, 17-year-old kids have completely taken over the debate with a credibility that is unassailable even by the president. That these kids are forcing change, let us hope. But even the governor of Florida has come out with a complete new gun package that would have been unthinkable by him 2 weeks ago. So it's a question of, I think, who's really got the leadership ball right now, to use a sports metaphor. And if the institutions can't adapt quickly enough, I think we're going to continue to see these spear points coming from local population groups that do adapt quickly.
What's going on at the moment, you're right, and I'm glad you brought it up in this way, is bottom-up change. And in the past, we've looked for top-down change, the people at the top understanding what has to be done and making it possible. And that's what's not working. And if the school children in Florida continue, then there's a chance that they will really produce meaningful and productive change in relation to one aspect of organization in this country. And there's a lot of discussion of populism, and the Economist had a special issue on populism, and it seems to be growing. That is, different sets of people in several countries that in the past tended to do what they were told and accept what the organization that filtered down from the top, are now beginning to take things into their own hands and vote differently and produce different types of results in elections. That so far the results they produced have not been particularly useful, but at least what they're doing is an interesting symptom of change.
Mm-hmm. Well,
so I'm an optimist, and I hope that that's what's going to produce the global future.
I would have to say that if we thought long and hard, there would be many, many examples of that kind of bottom-up change that those school children in Florida personify right now. That might be useful to think about for a future discussion, because these green sprouts are there. They're there. We often overlook them.
Good. We'll keep our eye on that in the coming weeks.
All right. Well, Professor Spooner, thank you very much for your time today.
Bye.
Bye.